Hi. All right. So this week we are looking at human adaptability and variation. Much of human adaptability, variation, and the phases we go as far as development, you should have already extracted from your reading, as well as why we see the variation that we do, such as skin color's relationship with vitamin D production and folate. What I want to discuss in this lecture is a little bit more about the concept of race. Now, your book mentions race, and this race is basically an attempt to classify the variation that we see in people, these adaptations that we have, whether they be cultural, biological, genetic, is an attempt to classify these. Now, the concept of race is fairly new, and it's not because we didn't have variation before, but the thought is that before the Renaissance, people were not able to travel large distances. So, for the longest someone would travel away from their home was probably 100 miles, and that was really, really traveling quite far. So the concept of race started coming around when people started traveling further and seeing other people. And then this idea of classifying comes around. Well, the idea of classifying actually, as we know from earlier readings, happened in science a lot earlier when we started trying to classify different species. So, for instance, some attempts at classifying humans was made by Robert Knox, who published a book in 1850, not too long ago, called The Races of Man. Now, I say here it reflects the scientific community's beliefs about race. What do I mean by that? Well, let's go back to Linnaeus. So, this push in the 1700s to classify all living species, everything around us, categorize it, this push spilled over into, well, people look different. Why not classify them into different categories? So, this idea of race being the static, unchanging, um, group that you're born into becomes prominent in the scientific community. This takes taken a step further when a gentleman by the name of Blumenbach uses features of the skull to try to categorize people into different groups, uh, classify them into groups called African, Asian or Mongoloid, Caucasian, or American Indian. And Blumenbach was under the impression that you can take specific measurements of someone's skull and this static, unchanging idea of race, you can establish what race that person fell into by just looking at their skull. So it's a very scientific and objective approach, supposedly, to being able to classify people. Well, this becomes an idea of being able to classify people. I want to introduce you to another concept that led this scientific approach down a very, very dark path. And this is the idea of unilineal evolution. Now, we discussed this when we talked about the fallacies or the erroneous um, concepts people have about evolution, and this goes along with it. Unilineal evolution takes this idea of evolution of going towards better, becoming more perfect, and applies it to cultures. The idea was that all cultures pass through same stages of development. And if we come across a culture that does not have the technology or does not have the means that one culture does, then they're probably arrested in their development somehow. They haven't developed as much as other cultures. And so this idea of unilineal evolution, which is modeled after this great chain of being, this hierarchy that everyone has to pass through, looks at Western culture as the absolute pinnacle of social evolution. And this concept gets saturated a little bit more. Well, if Western culture is the most absolute pinnacle of social evolution, then white men being on top must be the most evolved. And this starts, again, this really dangerous path. So, another concept, along with unilineal evolution, um, married with unilineal evolution, is this idea of biological determinism. And the idea of biological determinism states that behavior, intelligence, morals, all of these things that we now know are learned behaviors are cultural in their origin, was thought to be controlled by biology alone. So this idea that you can look at someone's skin color, look at someone's shape, and already be able to tell how intelligent they're going to be, how moral they're going to be, this concept started also around the 1700s and 1800s. Now, to combine these two concepts, to look at certain cultures as stunted in their development, and to look at other cultures or other cultures as more developed, and then to pin it on biology, to pin it on skin color, started a momentum that basically led to the way that a lot of European countries, a lot of Western countries were able to colonize most of the world. So creating this division, creating rank, and then creating control gave justification, supposedly scientific justification, to be able to control and enslave whole groups of people. Well, this concept was turned on its head first phenotypically by a gentleman named Franz Boas. You should remember him from the beginning of class. And he took Blumenbach's idea of race being static, and it's like, you know what, I'm going to look at this again. So he calculated what we call the cephalic index, which is basically length versus width on a skull, figuring out how big a skull is, and showed that there's more variation within groups of people than between groups of people, and also showed that from mom to son, from one generation to the next generation, this can actually change depending on where the individual grows up or lives. So this idea of race being static, Franz Boas showed that phenotypically race being static is invalid. Well, how about genes? This push towards the defining of race genetically became really, really kind of on the forefront again in the early late 1900s, late 90s, 1990s, and early 2000s. Actually, far before that, genes were shown to be invalid as far as a method of classifying people. Robert Lewontin showed that there's no genetic boundaries based on this racial concept. He looked at genetic variation and again found that there's more genetic similarities between what we supposedly think as different races than there is sometimes within a group. So there's more variety within a supposed race than between. So I wanted to address this idea of race being a valid concept. This is going to be one of your discussion questions. So I want you to further consider this. Race as a large taxonomic group of people is an optical illusion, the result of imposing cultural categories of meaning upon natural patterns of variation. And these natural patterns of variation are patterns that you should have been reading and learning about thus far. So when you look at race, when we look at these discussion questions, consider race in these terms, and consider how race can be part of human variation, part of what we discuss now as Klein, the changes in phenotype or genotype from one population to the next, and how adaptation and Klein and race are related, and where culture comes and plays a role in this. All right, thank you.